Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Bomber here. I'm joined today by Emily Coleman, who's the co-founder and CEO of HAI Analytics. Emily, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. As I was mentioning as we were setting up, I like supporting small businesses and consultancies because that is how I make my living. We always like to start by getting to know you and how you got to this point in your career. Can you catch us up on that story?
Sure. So I started out, I got a PhD in psychology and statistics. When I was doing that, I loved sort of the research side. I loved the stats. I wanted to keep doing that. I didn't necessarily want to go into academia because I didn't like the idea of having to move wherever there is a job. So I was kind of looking at other options, and I really kind of happened into my first job, which was at Syracuse University. I found it through the friend of a friend who was working there, and her boss in enrollment management wanted someone who could build statistical models to predict outcomes like yield and applicant conversion. I didn't know what enrollment management was. I didn't know that this research existed, but I sort of took it thinking, we'll see.
When you know the stats, Emily, you want to be able to flex them in the right directions, right?
Yeah. Yeah. There were many things I knew I didn't want to do. And being able to stay in, higher ed, which I do loved, had huge appeal.
Yeah.
So I started there. That was 23 years ago. And I loved it. I mean, I was originally hired to build statistical models to predict graduate student retention. And that kind of blossomed into like the undergraduate admit to enroll yield models, financial aid optimization models.
Right. Student success more broadly.
That's yes. In fact, I did a project for the law school where I built a model to predict bar pass likelihood.
Yep.
And that was something they could run, before students even arrived on campus to sort of identify students who might need the support. So I did that for 12 years. I eventually was the assistant VP of enrollment management there. And then my husband's job moved us to Massachusetts, which is where I'm from. I was happy to come back. But because of that, I went to work at a higher ed consulting company, doing a lot of the same things, a lot of financial aid optimization. And I sort of oversaw a team of analysts who were building those models.
I hear there's a lot of higher ed institutions in the Boston area.
Yes, there are a few. It's a pretty good area for higher ed. And then a coworker and I decided to leave there about 6.5 years ago to found HAI. We did that for a few reasons.
Let me jump in real quick, Emily. So you're founding a company you called HAI, and this is 2019.
This is 2018.
This is pre-March of 2020 when COVID hit, and then pre-ChatGPT November of 2022. You had just founded, and then all this stuff started happening. Maybe that's a podcast in and of itself, because I founded what I'm doing in November of 2019. So a lot of it is like right into these two concurrent waves that we're going to manage through. Fascinating stuff.
Yes. Yeah. And I would say that COVID definitely did shape the work that we're doing. One of the reasons we wanted to found the company and what HAI stands for is human and artificial intelligence. And we saw a lot of, really brilliant people come out of their undergrad programs with these incredible stats backgrounds. They knew how to build these AI models, these machine learning models. But there was kind of this theory that, if you have enough data, you just dump the data into the model and then the model tells you the answers. We knew from all of our work that is very dangerous. That models need interpretation.
I've even heard there's a bias to accept information that comes from technology over and above information that comes from humans. Some of us watched too much Star Trek growing up. There's that idea of it almost as like the infallible oracle. But I think there's a few dents in that armor post ChatGPT, which we'll get to a bit, but like your area of AI specifically is more predictive analytics. Can you describe some of the nuance there, some of the distinctions?
Yeah. So the kind of AI models that we deal with are another form of predictive analytics. So there are some older statistical techniques like logistic regression, which has traditionally been used to predict things like a student's likelihood to enroll.
Yep. That's
And
like
then
correlation, right?
it is. Yes. If you're doing sort of multiple factors, you're controlling for other factors.
Which, truth be told, is about as advanced as the conversation typically gets on this show. So if you're going deep on the stats, I'm going to try to hang with you, but I may ask you to slow down. Yeah.
No, no. It's just that basically the first AI models that I learned about were in graduate school and they were artificial neural networks. And
Yep.
it was essentially teaching a computer to learn language the way a child would learn language. And that helps us learn. I mean, I was also a philosophy major in college, so it's very
Nice.
interesting to think that we're creating these machines that will teach us how to learn how we learn. You know, there are a lot of different types of those models. There are these kind of machine learning models where if you have huge data sets, they can be very powerful in terms of their predictive ability. They're really just other versions of statistical models that predict outcomes. For what we do, because the data sets we use are typically not that large, we're usually using the older statistical techniques. Those usually, we have a program that can test different models against each other. So you can test like a machine learning model against a logistic regression and kind of see which one is more accurate. And oftentimes we see that, you know, these kind of more traditional stats tests are more accurate, but there's so much hype around AI. I hear people talk about it in a way that, you know, is so far beyond what it actually is.
I've been thinking a lot about how, like, it's kind of like looking in the mirror. And I feel like people like to obsess on certain elements of AI because we're fascinated by ourselves.
Mhm.
And it's also kind of like seeing faces in clouds, right? There's not as much of a there. This is the philosophy. You got me going when I heard you have a philosophy background. You know, just the idea that there's not really a there in terms of a consciousness. And again, another podcast episode, but the words are appearing on the page, the images are appearing before us, but there's not like a sense of shared human consciousness.
Right.
That's where consulting comes in.
That's right.
That's the way I think about it.
That's right. So, you know, we sort of interpret the models, we build them and we interpret them, and we know how to apply them in our space specifically, which every industry is unique in kind of the red flags you have to look out for when you build a statistical
Right.
model, and higher ed is kind of its own domain.
Right.
So that's kind of what we do. The other reason that we wanted to found a company was we wanted to help institutions become more self-sufficient when it came to data analytics.
Right.
So we saw, you know, institutions just heavily reliant on vendors that you can never get out of that relationship because
No.
everything they're doing is kind of secret, you know, it's in a black box. And we just thought that was ridiculous. And we wanted to work with schools to help them build that data analytics capability, which we have done. The thing about COVID is right before COVID, we talked to several schools that wanted to do this. They wanted to develop in-house capabilities. And then COVID hit and everyone was like, okay, we need to like, no, we're not changing anything. You know, everything is like, so we have kind of gotten back into that.
It also seems like in some ways COVID might have accelerated enterprise capability building because once they went through using, like I'm interviewing you in Zoom right now, once this becomes like we're fish in water,
Yes.
the training opportunities kind of get better and the capabilities, especially like digital capabilities, like you're talking about, you know, data science, data analytics, machine learning, that's kind of knowledge work nowadays. And, you know, in some ways, if you don't have a dedicated team doing it, you almost want your entire workforce to be kind of elevating in this way. And, you know, I talk a lot to folks in higher ed, but I also talk to folks outside of it. I'd love to hear more from you on, you know, why higher ed? What do you think is unique about that space? The data story of higher ed and how that relates to the work that you're doing.
Yeah. So I think higher ed as a space is kind of on this edge of needing to become more modern. And COVID did help with that in many ways where, you know, the schools that were set up to teach classes distance learning, they fared the best during COVID.
Yep.
And this kind of traditional model where, you know, everyone lives on campus and it's sort of knowledge for the sake of knowledge, which is a wonderful thing. And, you know, college has become so expensive that families and students have become much more like consumers where they want to get the
Yes.
best deal.
I think that's kind of on both sides. It's almost like a productization of higher
Mhm.
ed that
Yes,
that
yes,
has taken place.
yes.
And I was at a company that was selling educational units, Kaplan Test Prep, a very straightforward business model. But it was interesting at the time for me to see how higher ed was kind of assimilating that. And then Kaplan had a big higher ed presence. But, it's interesting how from the parent side, and then honestly, I think from the university side, it's almost like running a slightly larger business, but it's like
Yes,
running a business. You got to get the fannies in the seats. You got to push them through the
yes,
system. Having worked at Kaplan again, like I do think there's a level of detail to the data that you can track. And then, especially if you have some longitudinal data against a pretty tight data set, that's kind of the holy grail is if you can kind of get clean data
mhm,
and then apply that smartly to your objectives. Your background in enrollment makes a lot of sense there too, where like the business objectives really,
yes,
among others, are to have enough people enroll. And especially in this day and age where, funding beyond enrollment, it's fingers crossed, things can change. It does become much more like we need to sell these seats.
yes, yeah,
And there's a lot of models, to your point about higher ed being on the edge of kind of innovation. There's a lot of models more on the consumer facing side or even like media consumption side where like you can quantify what's it worth to kind of get
yes,
this data outcome and then
yeah,
kind of start designing models that start predicting that outcome. Pretty
right.
fascinating space. And then honestly, I do joke that we've all been aging in dog years lately, but it does seem like, despite the deep history you had before, I imagine you've learned a ton since founding
Yes.
HAI. What jumps to mind? Any advice for folks out there? Lessons learned, maybe having navigated the last 6.5 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has become very much a business, and that kind of rubs people the wrong way when you talk about higher ed as a business, but
Yeah.
it is. Most institutions are heavily dependent on tuition as their
Yeah.
main source of revenue.
It could be more than that. And it should be, and aspirationally, you want to actually have a culture and a vision and a strategy. But if you don't have a business
Right,
or an enormous endowment, you're not going to survive.
right.
And I think everyone's aware of college closures,
Yeah,
and that is a reality. So it's sort of like the bottom side
yeah,
of the scenarios. It's pretty scary. And if you're leading, you're president of a university or you have some responsibility for their online programs or your CTO or you're kind of in that space, they need help.
yes.
And because it's challenging, that's where the consultancy angle
Mhm.
fits in. Insights on that side would also be great. But what do people maybe not know about higher ed that you think might be interesting?
Well, I think that one of the big challenges that institutions face and what they can learn from businesses is they're not nimble. They have, buildings, they have resources that are dedicated to a specific topic or field. They have tenured faculty. So we have seen, especially in the last 15 years, so many shifts in the programs that are offered, the interest that students have. And it has been very difficult for many institutions to respond to that, to be
Right.
able to offer the programs that students want while maintaining other programs. I mean, I've worked with schools where, they sort of have a program that year after year, it has this enrollment goal that they never even come close to. And, you ask, like, should you maybe change that? But the feeling is they can't because they have a building and they have faculty. And
Right.
so that is where I think business consultants are really needed in higher ed to come in and help. And that's outside my area of expertise, but to help institutions figure out how can we be more nimble? How can we still offer that kind of traditional education? The idea of tenure, you talk about fires, and I have many friends who are in the faculty. I understand, why institutions started tenure. I appreciate the fact that we want to give academics the freedom to find answers. It
Yeah.
shouldn't be about publish or perish. But it is a very strange system that you don't see many other places. I think the
Right.
Supreme Court might be other place that you see it where, it's kind of you're here for life. And I don't know what the solution to that is, but I do think that that's part of what makes it difficult for institutions to adapt.
It's really hard to be a university president nowadays.
Yes.
Like that's something I've certainly come to learn having interviewed them and also tracked the space and talked to people who work with folks in higher ed. It's hard.
Yeah.
And to your point, you know, it got really hard in 2020 to adapt to that change. And then it got really hard again now with AI being something that students are asking about
Mhm.
and your board of trustees are asking about. Like you're
Mhm.
kind of being hit from every direction in terms of that. What types of data questions are emerging, and do you see any trends in terms of the type of stuff that higher ed is looking at in terms of its dashboards and kind of benchmarks?
Mhm. I think one of the things is just being able to have those dashboards.
Step one, Emily, have a dashboard.
Yes, and have it be interactive and have it
Mm.
be easy to update with all of the chaos caused by COVID. And it's kind of always something in higher ed. So last year they redid the FAFSA and that was a whole mess, right?
Mhm.
There's always something that makes it so that the prior cycle will not perfectly predict the current cycle. And we're building our models on the prior cycle. And so the thing that we need to do in addition to predictive analytics is we need to be able to track data very closely throughout the cycle. We need to be
We
able
kind of have to have the underlying, if I'm hearing you right, even beyond the dashboard's reporting on something underneath it. So like
Mhm,
your actual health and resilience of your actual data infrastructure, not to mention, cybersecurity
yeah.
and data privacy, which are also huge trends that are probably accelerating now,
Mhm.
certainly due to AI. You must have plenty of demand. What's it like on that side? It does seem like, from my perspective, the main kind of mega trend that I've seen hitting higher ed in the last, say, 5 to 10 years is agile and lean, like,
Mhm,
which is kind of what you're describing,
mhm.
that awakening. And you still need some of these big waterfall projects, moonshots, but generally, like your data operation, your decision support, you want it to be based on, well, these are the metrics that keep us in business. And this is how they're trending. This is what we're expecting. And if we're seeing variance, we understand maybe some hypothesis as to why, and then we're able to move
Yes.
quickly in response to that. But I
Mhm,
think your macro point about higher ed, shared governance almost limits your ability to move fast. And,
mhm.
you know, I found that always to be interesting on the consultant side is that, when you're small, there are advantages to that. And when you're a consultant, there are advantages to that. I think they're both tied to this sense of perspective and objectivity and then also advocacy. So it's like I have a clear read on the space, I'm experienced, I understand it, but then beyond that, I know how to use these skills
Yeah.
in support of your needs. We're basically Liam Neeson's, Emma. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, definitely. That's what I tell people all the time.
What about just in terms of that though, like the skills,
Mhm.
that unique set of skills that are differentiators. As a consultant, you do have to kind of stay out ahead on a lot of these things. And then also you're in higher ed spaces where they're trying to go through kind of digital transformation and change
Mhm.
management and, reorganization around AI or student success. And there's a lot of like austerity too. There's a lot of like, we don't want to spend more.
Mhm.
What's it like working with higher ed right now? And, as someone who loves higher ed, what's some upside potential?
Yeah, there's a lot of upside. I mean, there's so much positive impact on the students at each college. One of the things that we talk a lot to our clients about is kind of being able to articulate the return on investment. And a college education, as expensive as it is, still has the highest return on investment of really anything you could put your money into.
Mhm.
But they need to be able to articulate that. And we've sort of gotten into this place where, financial aid isn't just given to those who need it, it's also given sort of merit-based aid. And we've gotten into this culture where parents are comparing, this is
Yeah,
like a status symbol, like how much money
right.
did no one wants to pay full price.
It's like shopping for your first car.
It is. Like, if you had real bragging rights, if you got a good deal on a car, like, you made this kid that's so smart that he
Yeah.
got this scholarship. So that's, put institutions in a difficult situation. The ones that I think, it's funny because I was just saying that they need to be nimble, but the schools that we see that are most successful are nimble, but also not, they don't just react to everything, not too reactive. So
Mhm.
you do see, institutions just like businesses where every little thing that comes along, like, okay, now we have AI. So we
Yeah.
build these huge labs
Right.
for, these supercomputers, and
Mhm.
things have to be kind of thought through. And, obviously the institutions that do the best are the ones that kind of take their time with that. And
It reminds me of the John Wooden quote, move fast, but don't hurry.
yes,
Be deliberate and smart and kind of cautious about big decisions. But then when you make them,
yes.
go strong at them. And then part of how you go strong at them is, I guess, getting back to that dashboard idea.
I think it's interesting. Predictive analytics can really boost efficiencies in really any sector. So, where we're looking at, what's the impact of a financial aid dollar on a student's decision to enroll or on a student's ability to stay enrolled.
Right.
We also have worked with capital campaigns and fundraising where you're taking a lead database and you're looking at, who of this huge database are
Yeah.
most likely to give.
That's going to be increasingly relevant, I would think.
Yeah. Yeah. So that can help, with a small staff, help with outreach and really being kind of lean, as you mentioned earlier, and efficient.
Mhm.
And dashboards always kind of go hand in hand for the same reasons that I was talking about a bit earlier in terms of no statistical model is perfect. The statistical model needs to inform your decisions, but then you also need to really be tracking data to make
Yeah.
sure that nothing has changed outside of the model that you weren't expecting.
Mm.
And it's the same for, for fundraising. I mean, dashboarding can be used to kind of look at, are we going to meet our goals? And if not, how do we respond as quickly as possible to that?
Mhm. And I'm a bit of a data viz nerd. Our household may have some Edward Tufte books in it. If you are going to create a graph, I did work at Kaplan, developed like reporting tools over there. When somebody wants to see how they did on their GMAT, you got to throw in some bells and whistles. Is there anything you're noticing on that side? Data visualizations also become much more democratized. It
Mhm.
used to be harder to get that capability up. But also there are platforms like Tableau and
Mhm.
others, Python is another one people talk about in terms of harder skills that are kind
Mhm.
of in the space. Are there any trends you've noticed just specifically around like dashboards and kind of like the evolution of data science roles and skills?
Yeah, we've seen that, dashboards, regardless of what they're built in, it used to be the case that you might get it updated weekly if you're lucky, or it might be monthly. If you're working with a vendor on the dashboard, it often requires exchange of data. You send data, they update. And there are new platforms out there that make this much easier. They really put the control in the hands of the client. They can make changes to the dashboard without, a Tableau or a Power BI background. They can kind of look at things, interact with the dashboard in ways that helps them make good decisions. And there
Mhm.
are softwares that I think one of the biggest hurdles in higher ed, which you mentioned, is just kind of the availability of data, the cleanness of data. We still see institutions where different departments are keeping their data in their Excel sheet. And,
Yeah.
there's just these things are never tied together.
Yeah. I always think of it like there's the old saw, like your product winds up resembling your org chart. For
Yes.
me, I would extend it to like your data infrastructure resembles your org chart. And
Yes.
anyone who's worked with higher ed realize plenty of silos,
Yeah.
fiefdoms, like
Yeah.
lateral ownership. So like
Yeah.
how much of the data is understood centrally underneath these kind of spaghetti configuration? Like it's a little,
Yeah.
and that's just the nature of iterative,
Yeah.
decentralized like development. But it does seem like even just finding a coherent data infrastructure to report on
Yeah.
has to be a big part of the work.
Yeah, it does. And we work with a software product called Alteryx, which is very good at tying together disparate data sources, cleaning data.
Mhm.
Someone without, a huge technical background can sort of learn how to use this, and then that can be used to build the dashboard. So it
Mm,
really can clean up data for, just for internal knowledge. So you
yeah,
exactly what's happening. But the other thing that institutions do a lot of is reporting to external agencies. And, they have to report so much data. And for some institutions,
right,
this is people's full-time job to
right,
spend the whole year gathering the data for a survey that will be exactly the same next year. So,
right. Historically, there's been funding tied to doing that, so you need to stay
yes,
in compliance there.
absolutely. But now there are ways to kind of systematize that or
Mhm.
so that schools can, be paying attention to much more important things.
And then what about on the other side, like the centralized, data sources of record, like public data? That
Mhm.
is something I think folks are perhaps I'm a little shook by with the new Doge
Yeah, yeah.
stuff that's happening is just access to data systems is not something to be kind of cavalier about. There's some risk there. What about the underlying decision making around things like cybersecurity, things like even like data science, when frequently the leadership in higher ed is not technical? They're more
Mhm.
frequently a liberal arts background who kind
Mhm.
of got to like a managerial position. Maybe this is where your philosophy and your psychology background actually come in handy. How do you work with folks like that? And
Mhm.
how do you kind of translate the more technical aspects into language that higher ed leadership understands?
Mhm.
Or is higher ed leadership starting to ramp faster and perhaps that stereotype I was putting out there is a little bit dated?
Yeah, I think what we have seen is that stereotype is often true, but at most schools, they now have a CIO who is, most schools are understanding that this is really important, that we need
Mhm.
to protect student data.
Yeah.
It varies in terms of, how sort of strict they are about it. And we see that with clients where, if the data that we ask for, and we don't ask for things like social security number, but we are asking for, street address or things that are identifiable. There are different sort of levels of hoops that we have to go through in order to get access to the data, which is totally understandable and
Right.
should be that way.
Mhm.
We spend a lot of time making sure that the way we keep data is secure and, the systems that we're using are up to date. It is a huge issue. I think some schools have been reactive and gone overboard in terms of like, they won't share data with each other. Like you'll see
Mhm.
the financial aid office won't share data with the admissions office, which is,
Oh, even within a university. Mm.
yeah,
Right.
which is, I think going way too far. But definitely, data security has to be a part of the conversation all the time.
Yeah. And then the places to look that are publicly available, if folks are interested in doing more research in higher ed, or maybe they want to become an expert, kind of following your path a little bit, publicly available places to look. I know that's another thing that, getting reliable data as departments are cut and as the federal or state infrastructure suddenly is pulled back, you want to make sure those clearinghouse data
Yeah.
places are clean and are worth looking at. But what's your advice for someone who wants to think about data science and kind of learn more about that, play around with public data in this space? Any suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, there are huge databases available publicly. So the National Center for Educational Statistics, NCES, that's one of the places where colleges have to report data to every year. It's a
Yeah.
huge amount of data. You can download all of it. You could go in there and just pull it all down if you have a computer that has enough speed. The problem with it is it's always a bit outdated. So like the most recent year you're getting is 2 years ago.
Mhm.
But it still is a great place to look for, if you wanna look at trends, if you wanna look at kind of metadata. So rather than looking within an institution at the factors that are predicting outcomes, looking kind of across the industry.
Yeah.
And that is really interesting. A lot of institutions also make descriptive data available. So they'll have institutional research websites where you could find, I mean, this would be labor intensive, but you could, in theory, go to many different institutions' websites and
Yep.
kind of extract their data. There's a lot of emphasis on transparency. So you do see schools that are putting a lot of data out there that allow their prospective students to kind of assess the strength of the institution. And that's available to anyone who would want to go, gather it.
And then on the skill side, to get sharp in the space that you're at, would you have advice for someone early career, suggestions in terms of, I was kind of going somewhere there where if you're interested in a field, see what data is available, and then you're at least learn how to play with publicly available data.
Yep.
That's just useful. Not to mention, we made it pretty far without talking a lot about AI. But how does AI perhaps come in? What kind of skills and, the nature of the work for a data scientist or a consultant? How do you see that evolving?
So I always say, and this has been consistent throughout my career, and I still stand by it, the thing that makes the best data scientists is just natural curiosity. Anyone can learn how to build statistical models. And so the person you're talking about who actually would go out and kind of play with data just to find answers, that's a person who's going to be successful as a data scientist. There are obviously college courses that can teach you different models. There are free courses online. Right now, R is big because it's an open data source. I can't write any code in R. A lot of sort of younger people can.
Right.
There's emphasis on that, and that's great. But I think really at the heart of it is just if you are a curious person who likes to find answers, then you kind of get the stats background, and there are so many things that you can do with it.
Yeah, and I think it's also perhaps in service of what? In some ways, the best way to develop these skills is to actually have a why
Yes.
behind what you're doing. But any suggestions there on kind of like aligning your career with maybe some kind of vision? Because you've gotten to an interesting place, and there might be listeners out there who are trying to figure out how to get there. Any suggestions in terms of your career, lessons learned, or advice for folks charting their route?
Yeah, I don't know that I'm the best person to take advice from, but I am not like a 5-year planner. I've never been, where do I want to be in 20 years? It's always been kind of, where do I want to be right now? Am I happy right now? And then be open to opportunities. So I feel like that is what I have done. I went into something that was interesting to me. I was open to opportunities. I'm not the type of person who would think, I'm not smart enough for that. That's just my personality is I'll figure it out. So I think that's a big part is kind of being confident, being open-minded, and, letting it sort of evolve. That's a way to stay relevant because, if you've built your whole career on some field that is now outdated, you're not going to have transferable skills. So that's how I've done it. Again, I don't know that that's the
I
best
like it.
advice, but
Playing
it's
with your head up, opportunistic, keeping your eye on what's going on around you. Amazing conversation here today with Emily Coleman, who's the co-founder and CEO of HAI Analytics, higher ed, data science, predictive analytics consultancy out of Massachusetts. Emily, folks who stuck around this long, they want to figure out what some takeaways are. Concluding thoughts, messages for our listeners before we wrap up here?
Concluding thoughts, I think, data science is not going away. It's a huge field. I think just not getting caught up in the hype. And so much of, AI, that's what happens. And we go into meetings where, trustees will say like, well, what about AI models? They don't really know what that means, but this is what we're hearing. So just kind of, following trends, but don't get caught up in the hype, I think is the way to go.
Yeah. Wise words from Emily Coleman. Also pretty close to quoting Flava Flav there.
Oh, really?
Don't believe the hype. Amazing stuff here, Emily. Thank you so much for joining me on today's show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And our listeners, if you enjoyed what you heard, please subscribe, write us a review, tell your friends, do all the good things. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.